Welcome to this short presentation that summarizes some classroom research findings I did as a part of the Smart Tech Use for Equity research group. This research took place over February to May 2015 by myself, Melissa Foster, at Castle Park Middle School in an 8th grade science classroom. The focus question I used for this research was how does creation and use of multimedia projects on the iPad impact unit assessment results for English learners in middle school science? These middle school science students were my students in SEI classes and non-SEI classes in which iPads were issued at a 1-to-1 ratio for all students. Most of my unit lessons will incorporate the iPad. The first set of data I collected used a modified lab that was developed in the summer of 2014 by the Create and Spay War team, and these students did this lab as an inquiry project to explore reflection. After this, they did a gizmo on laser reflection. Gizmos is an online simulation that the Sweetwater District has purchased for all middle school students for the calendar year of 2014 and 15 and allows students to manipulate different objectives, in this case for lasers and mirrors, but also other activities. By the end of these two activities, the students were able to summarize the relationship between the angles of the mirror and reflection of the laser. They then used this to create an iMovie that summarized all of their findings. This project was the first time students had used iMovie in a classroom setting. These instructions told them what they had to do for the project, including using some type of sound, music, and/or voice. This was their first introduction to not only the app, but using multimedia to present their understanding of a topic. What follows after this is an example from a student, an ELD 3-4, and his project produced in my 6th period SEI class. What you'll see in this video is both images of the lab itself, which the student has included his own pictures here, as well as images from the gizmo that student did. You'll also see the student in his own words has attempted to explain what his images are showing. Though not comprehensive, the student was able to put in his own words what he got out of this lab. Additionally, he was able to show a personal example that he knew about laser reflection prior to even doing this lab, making a connection. Of note, 95% of students chose to use music rather than voice, and 100% of ELD 1, 2, and 3-4s chose not to use their voice at all. In looking at the quality of the presentations, I was concerned that this lack of voice actually made an impact on the students' ability to improve comprehension and overall gain mastery of the concepts. So next, I wanted to look and see if this project had any impact on unit assessment grades. The metrics shown here are from the results of an objective and open-ended written response quiz the students took after the iMovies were due. On the left, you'll see the scores of my SEI classes, and on the right, my non-SEI classes. Interestingly, the mean for the SEI classes was approximately 4% higher than that of the non-SEI classes. The reason that I chose to look at this assessment data is even though our types of assessments are changing under the Next Generation Science Standard and Common Core, students are still responsible to show and demonstrate mastery through some type of assessment. I wanted to see if there was any type of relationship between the multimedia projects that students were doing in class and their overall assessment scores. From these results, I wasn't convinced that there was any type of impact that multimedia project had on this unit assessment. Overall, I thought these assessment results were consistent with previous metrics on other assessments. So I wasn't convinced that this multimedia project was having an overall impact. Also, some other initial thoughts were that this project idea had potential, but it was not structured enough yet to give students the opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of the material. Also, since this was the first time many of the students had used the app, I think they got distracted by the how-tos and creative aspect instead of focusing on content. For the next trial, I needed to revise the project. That said, I found it interesting that the one question on the assessment that directly correlated to the lab, gizmo, and iMovie project, 80% of students across all classes got that question correct. Maybe there was something about this project and the impact on assessment, and I wanted to look further. The second set of data took us into a new unit, evolution, from late February to early March. Here, I changed the multimedia project parameters in one sense specifically. Students had to use their own voice in combination with their pictures, video, and text. Most of the students did their project in Explain Everything, but some did choose iMovie instead. Their project had to summarize the evidence for evolution, and there was no direct instruction on this topic. Students instead gathered evidence from stations around the classroom for their projects. The project you will see next is from one of my ELD 3-4 students in the 6th period SEI class. You'll notice that the student has written all of his words in English, but he is speaking exclusively in Spanish. This was something that we agreed upon with all of my students because I wanted them to use their voice no matter how they did it or in what language they did it in, as long as they could express themselves clearly.
La estructura homóloga presenta y explica cómo todos los seres vivos tenemos los mismos huesos, pero son usados para fines distintos. La evidencia de los embriones presenta cómo todos los embriones de los seres vivos están correlacionados. Las estructuras vestigiales presentan cómo los huesos que fueron usados por nuestros antepasados son usados ahora de una manera diferente. Un ejemplo es el pingüino que, aún teniendo aletas, no puede volar. El ADN de todos los seres o organismos que habitan en el planeta están correlacionados de alguna manera con las células. Esa es la evidencia de los récords de fósiles y las ilustraciones muestran fósiles que se han encontrado en este periodo. Gracias por su atención.
As this project is a great example of, it is critical that the students are allowed to use their voice in a way that is comfortable for them. The student wrote in English but spoke in Spanish, and his message was very clear, and his message was correctly communicated. In this case, I learned that both languages can be used in these multimedia projects in an effective way. After these Explain Everything projects were done, the students did a peer review on each other. Then, shortly after, took an assessment that was similar in length and type to the assessment done in the WAVES unit. Interestingly, the mean for both my SEI and non-SEI classes were much higher for this assessment than they were for the WAVES unit and for any previous assessment in my class. After this assessment, the students also added to their projects as they gathered and synthesized evidence for the common ancestry of apes and humans. They used a series of multimedia resources added to their project, and by the end had to construct a written scientific explanation that apes and humans have a common ancestor, citing 3 pieces of evidence and supporting each piece of evidence with reasoning. Those students were very hesitant to incorporate their voice into the Explain Everything projects. I think that using a spoken portion in the project made a huge difference for students in both comprehension as well as being able to use the language in follow-on assignments and assessments. This writing sample is from the same ELD 3-4 student that had produced the Explain Everything project you viewed earlier. I'd like to draw your attention to the very last sentence that reads, "My last claim is the DNA. Another piece of evidence is DNA. All living things have DNA, but apes and humans have in common 98.8% of DNA." This is significant because this piece of evidence was drawn directly from the student's Explain Everything project, and the student was able to reproduce this evidence in a written explanation that served as an assessment for this unit. Though there is issues we're still working on with syntax, grammar, and sentence structure, the student's message is clear. He understood some of the evidence for the common ancestry of apes and humans. These metrics show the assessment results of the written explanation the previous sample was from. Notably, the mean for all of these classes was slightly lower but fairly comparable to the assessment data gathered from the objective part of this test. This showed me that there was value in having the students use their voice in a multimedia project to demonstrate understanding, and then be able to replicate that understanding in an assessment that's either written or objective-based. I would also like to point out that there were students who failed the objective part of the assessment that followed the Explain Everything project. Normally, one of the interventions at our school for students who fail assessments is to reteach, then retest them. However, I looked at their Explain Everything projects if students had gotten a failing grade, and I wanted to see if there was a correlation between their projects and their assessment grade. And I found there indeed was a correlation, especially for students who didn't do the project. In this case, I had the students go back, update, and or review their projects to show me they understood the material rather than doing a traditional reteach retest. I found that this was much more effective than following the traditional intervention model of my school. I think this is important to note because students could demonstrate their understanding in more than one way. Traditionally, the assessment data from the test was the only way to see student understanding. However, if they could, in their own words, using their own voice, explain to me they understood the material, I consider this mastery and use that as an assessment for the unit as well. In addition to these assessment results, I found that the creative expression allowed in these multimedia projects demonstrated a different level of student engagement that didn't come through in their traditional written work and other projects. Some of my English learners truly constructed some of the best multimedia presentations. They also seemed more confident when the project was multimodal, and they referenced these projects when it was time to use productive language in a task. Overall, I was encouraged by the results of this project. However, I do have a few steps for the way ahead that I want to investigate as I continue to look at my focus question. Some of these next steps, including follow-on multimedia projects the students are both currently engaged on and that I may plan for the future. For example, I have students currently constructing a website on artificial selection. Also, next year, a few teachers, including myself, are adopting the reading apprenticeship model for our classes that are going to introduce literacy in a different form to some of our students. I'm interested to see how I can combine this with my task for technology in the classroom and hopefully mutually support the students' development of literacy skills in science. Thank you for taking the time to go over this brief research that I've done in the classroom and help me explore how this may help my practice in the future. I welcome any questions and feedback and look forward to the way ahead.